It's just about a year since a deal creating one of the biggest regional economic blocs in Africa came into force. The Tripartite Free Trade Area Agreement, TFTA, brings together the East African Community, EAC, Southern African Development Community, SADC, and the Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa, COMESA. The TFTA comprises 29 countries, representing 53% of the African Union's membership. It aims to deepen market integration, spur infrastructure development, and foster industrialization. However, the merger presents both opportunities and challenges. This week on the program, we track how far the TFTA has come since its creation, its promise, and the headwinds it may face. I'm Penina Karibe. Welcome to Talk Africa. There are different levels of regional integration countries can pursue. The customs union is the first. Through the customs union, the bloc seeks to remove internal tariffs and establish a common external tariff on goods imported from outside the region. The second is a common market, which is a merger of two or more countries in which there is free movement of persons, goods, labor, services, and capital. The monetary union is the third pillar of integration. This creates a single regional currency that will facilitate easier trade among partner states. Political federation is the highest pillar of integration. Once the first three are established, full economic and political union is achieved. Member countries surrender national sovereignty to supranational institutions, and a permanent legal and institutional framework is established. Joining me now to unpack the EAC-SADC and COMESA Tripartite Free Trade Area Agreement are, from Johannesburg, Letabo Sitole, Managing Director at Amila Africa. From Lusaka, we have Zodwa Mabuza, the Chief of Sub-Regional Initiatives at the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, UNECA. And from Dar es Salaam, we have Novatas Igosha, International Affairs Analyst. Welcome everyone to the program. Zodwa, I will begin with you because in 2018, you co-authored a paper with David Luke titled TFTA and AfCFTA Making a Case for Consolidation, where you looked at these two groupings. So I have two questions for you. Number one, how was the EAC, SADC and COMESA merger negotiated given the existing tensions and disagreements between some countries in the region? And two, how different is the TFTA from the African Continental Free Trade Area?
Yes, I coordinated the negotiations among the 26 countries of the COMESA, EAC, and SADC, and we authored this paper with David Luke. On the issue of tension, maybe let me start by saying negotiators are diplomats, so we could not see the tension. But, you know, negotiations can be tough, where each negotiator basically show their negotiation prowess. So that's the only tension that one could see. But in terms of the conflict that is there in the region, it was not displayed at the negotiation table. So when you look at the tripartite FTA, it's very much different from the African Continental Free Trade Area. There are some similarities, but these are two different configurations. The tripartite FTA is made up of 29 countries with a population of about 800 million people and a GDP of about $1.8 trillion, I think, the last time I checked. AfTA is comprised of all African countries, the 54 African countries. It's a much bigger market. And perhaps the other difference that one can note is that the AfTA has moved faster than the TFTA, and there are reasons for that. But the two are different, whereas they did, like the AfTA did borrow a lot from the text of the tripartite FTA agreement.
Okay, so let me move to you, Novitas. What has it taken for the EAC, the SADC and COMESA merger to start working, considering that the blocs are at different stages of integration? We have the EAC, which is like, you know, it has achieved the highest level of customs union, but it still falls short of a monetary union and political federation.
In the first place, we have to remember that these blocs are made by different member states and were established by different objectives. For example, following the Windhoek Treaty of 1992, SADC came into place as a bloc in order to challenge the former regime of apartheid South Africa, though despite nowadays South Africa is also among the SADC members. So I think it took time because there are institutional differences, market fragmentations, and of course each member has a different dispute resolution frameworks. You have to remember these blocs each has its own legal system and each has its own tariff regimes. But at the same time, when you come to the member states, each country has its own macroeconomic policies, but custom rules and custom revenues are also different. However, in a situation whereby maybe there is a member that is in a completely different institution, let's say COMESA, which is not part of East Africa and part of SADC, it requires to have market harmonization. And you have market harmonization only when you have frameworks that are similar, where you have reduced the bureaucratic situation. So I believe the TFTA is coming to harmonize all that to try to avoid the challenges that are coming into the merging of all these blocs.
Okay, so if Letabo, I come to you because Novitas have talked about the issue of legal systems that exist within these trade blocs and also the issue of tariffs. And if I look at what we just recently had the other day, the standoff between Tanzania on the one hand and South Africa and Malawi, all of these countries, the three of them, are in SADC, they are in COMESA, and now they are in the TFTA. So Letabo, two questions for you. Number one, you're in South Africa, you can break this down for us quite nicely. What exactly was the issue here? And also secondly, what mechanisms have been built to ensure that in the TFTA, we do not have similar issues?
At the heart of the recent, I will maybe use your words and say standoff between Tanzania, South Africa, and Malawi is Africa's old friend, which is non-tariff barriers. And you know that we've made a lot of progress in terms of trade liberalization from a tariff perspective within the different regs and also now within the AFCFTA. However, non-tariff barriers continue to impede intra-African trade. And these are, you know, those very pesky roadblocks to regional trade integration that sometimes come guised as technical regulations, sometimes as permits, sometimes as administrative delays. And in the case of Tanzania, South Africa, and Malawi, it was the imposition of new requirements and border checks on trucks that are coming from South Africa and Malawi. But the TFTA isn't short on tools. It's important that member states use these tools to their advantage. So I know that the agreement does contain a dispute prevention and dispute resolution mechanism, which I guess is maybe a bit similar to, you know, the one we see under the AFCFTA, and will be necessary and useful for monitoring and reporting non-tariff barriers, and also addressing them within quite speedy timelines. There's an online reporting tool that will prove useful, again, very similar to the AFCFTA, and allow businesses to report any blockages in real time and hopefully have them attached in real time. But again, I think like all things when it comes to policy frameworks and the implementation thereof in Africa, it all boils down to one big thing, which is political will and prompt enforcement. And I think that does remain the Achilles heel for African trade, yeah.
All right. So, Novitas, what are the challenges of overlapping membership where some countries in the EAC, SADC, and COMESA region possess multiple membership?
Thank you. That's a very good question. You see, this overlapping membership normally when it begins is seen as if it's a contribution to the bigger goal of economic integration and cooperation. However, it's really difficult for a country to be into 3 or 4 blocks, and these blocks have different demanding conditions and legal frameworks in order to have market forces that are harmonious. So the challenges would be many. Number one, it's administrative and legal challenge. You might find a dispute between member states that are under different dispute resolution mechanisms. For example, one is in East African community where you have the East African court, but the other one is in SADC, and unfortunately now the SADC does not have a SADC tribunal. It only relies on the summits, and summits cannot be enforced unless there is an agreement between 2 countries. But at the same time, it is very difficult for traders on the ground to be able to operate in their sector smoothly. So in my view, I think the merging normally comes down to political commitment, but at the same time, you find the legal framework involving these countries is going to undergo a very difficult situation when it comes to solving, let's say, trade disputes.
Oh, wow. So that brings me to you, Zodwa, then, pushing this forward from where Novatas has left. Which barriers, tariff and non-tariff, are slowing down investment and trade in the EAC, in SADC and COMESA? And how is the TFTA addressing all of these issues?
Maybe let me start with tariffs. The agreement itself removes all tariffs, trade tariffs among the state parties. So I think we have dealt with this. The negotiations was mainly to eliminate the tariffs. But then, as Letabo said, our best friend on the continent are non-tariff barriers. And I think the most common one has to do with customs administrative delays. And this is very disheartening because even on the border posts that are supposed to be one-stop border posts, I'll make an example. In Southern Africa, you have the Chirundu between Zambia and Zimbabwe. You find long queues of trucks. And that tells me that they're not functioning as one-stop border posts, such that you find that trucks can take up to a day or maybe 2 to clear. And then the other has to do with import licensing and permits. We are seeing it where countries come up with stories like, we want to protect our nascent or our infant industries. But these industries never grow. They remain nascent, they remain infant for a longest time. I can make an example of the sugar industry in Kenya, for instance. And then you have technical barriers to trade, which in some cases you find there's application of different standards, issues of sanitary and phytosanitary, which are then used as non-tariff barriers. And then the most common one has to do with transport and infrastructure constraints, where transport policies are not harmonized. And perhaps just in that, I can then introduce what the TFTA is doing. I'm happy to say, I think it was 2022 when the Tripartite FTA member states agreed on a number of road policies that applies in the 29 countries, and that is working. It's basically meant to make sure that transport policies are harmonized, and it basically facilitates the free movement of goods within the tripartite region.
Okay, and Novatas, what role is existing regional infrastructure in the East African community, the SADC and COMESA blocks, such as roads and railways and ports, playing in facilitating trade and investment flows? And even what more does the bloc need to do to ease the movement of goods and services?
When you have got reliable infrastructure, you've got systems that work, you're going to increase investors' confidence. No multinational or no major country would come up into a region where there is uncertainty of working mechanisms. So if you have got port exports that are efficient, but at the same time, policies that are predictable, you're going to make investors have confidence in you, but also you will continue to rise the confidence between member states, because the only way to have confidence among the member states is also to increase these coordinations. And therefore, in the near future, I look forward to mechanisms that would monitor how we coordinate all these kind of trade flows, try to harmonize tariff regimes, try to mitigate situations that arise from different macroeconomic policies and perhaps custom barriers and tariff barriers.
All right, so Letabo, coming to you, the TFTA alone would have countries with over 20 different currencies in it. Isn't there a large opportunity here to make cross-border payments easier and faster through systems like the Pan-African Payment and Settlement System? I mean, what do banks and mobile money funds and even central banks need to do to make this a reality?
You're very correct. I think that it is a golden opportunity for innovation. And I want to credit, some of the startups that we've seen burgeoning across the continent for already leading on this innovation, whether it's M-Pesa, Yoko, you could name so many of them. And what the Pan-African Payments and Settlement System would do is save the continent $5 billion annually in additional trade costs. Because, look, a lot of the trade on the continent is pegged against the dollar, and people are converting to dollar or euro or other payments because of the payment systems that we're using before receiving money, either in dollars or euros, and then converting it to their local currencies. And I think you can imagine how much of a headache that must be for traders, considering that 80% of the businesses on the continent are SMEs, and how much it is an impediment to trade facilitation and reducing the cost of trade for them. But for PAPS to work, I think the role of major banks will be to support SMEs, whether it be through traditional trade finance, but also innovating and coming up with non-traditional trade finance products for African SMEs that speak to their needs and market realities. And the sooner we come up with trade finance solutions and payments and settlement solutions that work for Africa's markets and for Africa's SMEs, we will see an increase in intra-African trade flows, and I guess broadly just greater development and innovation across the continent.
All right, thank you very much for that. Now we're going to take a short break. When we come back, we will look at what the future holds for the merger. Just stay with us. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Still with me are Letabo Sithole, Zodwa Mabuza and Novatus Igosha. Now, before the break, we looked at why the TFTA came into being. Let's now look at what the future may hold for the merged Southern African Economic Bloc. So, Novatus, I'll begin with you. We've explored the challenges facing the TFTA. On the brighter side of the coin, what opportunities exist for this grouping?
There are several opportunities. The biggest one is a large market for these member states, because we are talking about an area with a population of over 500 million people. So I do believe economically this is a very strategic foresight for member states to implement. But Africa needs to find a political will to mitigate circumstances that happen when agreements are held or when negotiations or, let's say, blocks like this come into a process of merging. Because without mitigation of issues, Africa is always criticized that we are good at talking the talk than walking the walk. And therefore, I think we need to come up with also frameworks to monitor the implementation of everything. But also we need to have platforms which we can have constructive dialogue in case of a challenge that happens between one country to the other, regardless of the bloc or the frameworks that they are within the membership. But also one crucial important thing is harmonization of institutions.
And Zodwa, coming to you with this big market that Novatus talked about, I mean, you can imagine the opportunities that exist even in terms of FDI, but what needs to be done to build credible institutions that run trade policy in the TFTA and that can negotiate trade deals on behalf of the bloc, similar, for example, to the way the EU Commission works?
Well, I think what African countries need to embrace and is sort of like implement is the issue of empowering the institutions that that they've set up, like the EU has done. But what you constantly hear are issues of sovereignty, where countries put their national interest ahead of those of the region. With every regional integration, there's some sovereignty that countries have to forego for the interest of regional integration. And what we have seen in our regional integration initiatives, we do not empower the Secretariat. They don't have much powers to basically hold countries accountable in the case of default, in the case of not implementing what they've agreed on. We've seen it in a number of cases, like the case of South Africa, Malawi, and Tanzania that you just mentioned, where countries just unilaterally decide to say, we are doing this. But the hands of the Secretariat, which should be basically providing an oversight of regional integration, are tied because they cannot really hold countries accountable. So for me, strong institutions are very important, but also strengthening trade governance.
Okay, so as we look to wrap up, I'm going to ask all of you this one question, and I'll start with you, Novatus. Looking at the global context, why is Africa's economic integration more urgent than before?
Frankly speaking, it is much more urgent right now than any other time in the history of modern history. I'll give you two examples. One is the shifting character of the United States of America, which is the world's largest market and #1 economy, which is trying to have a protectionist approach and giving tariffs to competitive economies. But secondly is the expansion and the rise of the People's Republic of China. So when two largest economies are in conflict, giving tariffs and reciprocal tariffs, Africa needs to work together, because this is the time we need to have to build capacities in our own institutions, of course, build capacities for our own people, because at the end of the day, reliance on foreign aid, for example, though aid was flowing before the Trump administration, it proved that it was not credible and it was not working sufficiently. So I do believe right now it is the time, especially for those in power, to understand that we need to have frameworks that are working and monitoring mechanisms that are going to make sure materialization of anything that is agreed between countries and its people is implemented effectively. I think this is the time that Africa really needs to work together to push on how to have more balance of trade, especially exports, to put value on what it can produce, but above all, to continue to make sure that infrastructure, financial flows are well coordinated by the central banks and other institutional frameworks that are in the region.
Okay, what about you, Letabo? What do you think? Where is the urgency in Africa's economic integration?
Africa is the final frontier for development. And I always try to use every platform to remind us all that we are home to the youngest and fastest growing population group in the world. In a couple of decades, we will account for more than half of the world's workforce. And I think it's very important now more than ever to ensure that, we don't miss this opportunity. And I think some of the regions where we've seen conflict on the continent is a glaring reminder that our youth needs great policies. Our youth needs to see economic development that is equitable, that empowers them to be economically active, whether that is through, trade or through the creative and cultural industries that are growing, whatever it is that governments are prioritizing economically will affect how our continent is shaped up, whether now or in a couple of years. But we have this golden opportunity. We've got this wealth of natural resources, but also a wealth of human capital and young Africans who are setting and leading global trends. So I think now more than ever, taking our position in the world, taking our economic development and our economic integration is important.
Zodwa, what are your thoughts on this?
It's time we take regional integration seriously. And we have all going for us. We have this big market that has just been ratified by so many member states, but also realizing that we are not currently trading much among ourselves, and the missing link is productive capacity. We need to industrialize. We need to process what we previously sent to other countries on the continent. We need to identify the comparative advantage of each country and allow countries to produce what they can produce best and trade among ourselves. Otherwise, if we continue like exporting raw materials, still sticking to our markets, we are not going to benefit from this. This is the time to look into intra-Africa trade, to boost intra-Africa trade. And perhaps I would like to remind all of us about the decision that was taken by heads of state in 2012, where they approved the Boosting Intra-Africa Trade Action Plan. That plan had 7 clusters. It identified all the supply side constraints that are impeding, that are basically an impediment to intra-Africa trade, infrastructure, trade-related infrastructure, trade finance, and other supply side constraints and all that. Those were identified, and if we were to go back to implement that action plan, we would definitely make a difference. And it is time for Africa to trade among ourselves.
It is time indeed. Thank you very much for that. And that's all for this edition of Talk Africa. A very big thank you to our guests, Letabo Sitole, Managing Director at Amila Africa, Zodwa Mabuza, Chief of Sub-Regional Initiatives at the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, and Novatus Igosha, International Affairs Analyst. Remember, you can be a part of this conversation online through our social media handles on Facebook and X. You can also catch the show on our YouTube playlist. To keep the conversation going and join us again next week for more Talk Africa. From me, Penina Karibe, and the team here in Nairobi. Until next time, it's goodbye.